Today we have a much requested topic. Uh and this one takes a lot of context, right? Sudan has a really rich history, and it has a really interesting ethnic context to the conflict that's going on. Um and for this episode today is, similar to the Congo discussion, what questions do we need to ask about Sudan? What do we need to know about Sudan, right? What's the contextual knowledge surrounding Sudan, right? So let's go ahead on and call the professor and get ready to discuss this topic. Hello?
Hello? Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Sounds good. How you doing today?
Fine, thanks.
That's good. That's good, man. This was a much requested topic. Uh and we're gonna go ahead and dive right into it. What do the people need to know about Sudan? What context do we need to even understand or begin to understand this conflict? I know so few people really know what is happening on that side of the world, especially after the countries were split. So, how would you approach this question, and from what lens do you think the average viewer should look at it from?
First of all, thank you and welcome everybody. The first thing that we need to be sure to pay attention to is that we are talking of Sudan, not Southern Sudan.
Mhm.
We are talking about Sudan, whose capital city is Khartoum. And we are basically trying to understand the current military conflict that is going on in the Sudan. So is the question, how did we get here and how do we make meaning of it?
Well,
Is that the question
again,
you want us to?
no, I was leaving it to be open ended. The first question was, what lens should we look at this conflict from? Right. We've been speaking about the lens and perspectives that we should view things in. Right. Whether it be as a voter or as a spectator. In the case of the Sahel states, how should the average viewer look at the conflict in Sudan?
Well, this is one of the easiest to understand, but it is one of the most complex of all conflicts because the Sudan has had an internal conflict since independence all the way in 1955. It was among the first African countries to gain their independence, and immediately after independence, it was engaged in a civil war. In fact, it has had three major civil wars since independence. And unlike other civil wars that seem to be short lived, a few years, the conflicts in the Sudan have been have taken very long. The first civil war immediately after independence, 1955, it lasted until 1972. The second one about early 1980s, and it went all the way to 2005. And then it is this second one that led to the breakup of what now we call Southern Sudan from Sudan. And then immediately after the overthrow of El Bashir around 2019, a civil war ensued now around 2023, and it is the one that is still ongoing now. So we can't get into the previous, we have no time to look at the previous civil war, so we can just talk generally about these civil wars and then just zero in on the current one. And basically, like it is with other civil wars or other conflicts in Africa, there is an element of ethnic stroke regional, as well as resources, their exploitation, and their division. And both the ethnic, regional, and resources tend to conflate. So sometimes what starts as a regional or an ethnic conflict ends up being enmeshed in conflicts over resources. So we cannot really identify that. Basically, Sudan, the leaders have been from the north, Arabs and Muslims. The resources have tended to be from the south, from owned by Africans who have tended to be black and also Christian traditionalists. So you can talk of all sorts of conflicts that those have, either a purely ethnic one, Muslim versus Christians, or animists and traditional religions, or you can look this as just one of color. You can also look at it in terms of Muslims, the Arabs in the north, who have always pretended to be superior to blacks, trying to control the resources of the south. In fact, this was the major bone of contention that led to the creation of southern Sudan. So there are all these issues. Arabs declaring their right to govern Sudan, Africans and blacks claiming to be politically marginalized and their resources being controlled by foreigners. There is an element of that really has its roots in the colonial legacy. More recent, and this was especially the cause of the Second Civil War, it revolved around the imposition of Sharia law that the northern Arabs, Muslims declaring that the entire Sudan need to be under Islamic law, the Sharia, and therefore non-Muslims in the south felt this was religious domination and exploitation, and hence triggering the Second Sudanese Civil War from 1983 to 2005. And really, it is that conflict that gave rise to the current one.
Wow. That's a lot of context, right? And you're right, it is simple, but because of how many actors there are, and because there's so many points of tension, it makes things more complex, right? You have the religious aspect of like you said, the Christians, the Muslims, the animists. Then you also have the ethnic aspect of being, sub-Saharan, Nilotic, or Arab, right? But
Mhm.
what's occurring, that another thing that I really saw was the conflict between the two generals, right? Um,
Yeah.
can you speak a little bit about that conflict between these two generals, and how that began? And is it true that they were allegedly friends at first?
They belong to the same government. So now let's fast forward to just before Southern Sudan is created. The Southern People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, was a rebel group that was fighting for the independence of now what we know as Southern Sudan, but definitely it was, at that time, it was just the Darfur area. So all the non-Arab groups rebelled around 2003 against the marginalization, against the domination, and against the Sudanese government. The war in southern Sudan by al-Bashir forces al-Bashir was the long-serving dictator of Sudan, because he was fighting rebel groups, because he was fighting insurgency groups. He didn't use the conventional military forces to fight in Darfur. He created a, a counter-insurgency group. Now, this is what would develop later to be the Rapid Support Force. These are the so-called Janjaweed fighters. They were created initially to fight the SPLA against what became Southern Sudan. It was also meant to help in the exploitation of Southern Sudanese resources by the government. And of course, when we talk of the government, we're talking technically of al-Bashir and his cronies, who just that clique of elites who controlled it. So rather than use the conventional army to fight in southern Sudan, the Janjaweed militias were used. But then when southern Sudan became independent, the question was, what do we do with them? So now efforts were being made, because these ones were fighters that were fighting for al-Bashir. Efforts were being made to regularize them, to integrate them to the military. Around this time, there was around the late, around 2018, 2019, just before al-Bashir was overthrown, there were signs that the military was planning to take over. There were signs that the overthrow of al-Bashir was almost a foregone conclusion. So al-Bashir himself tried to counter that by creating the Janjaweed militias to be a counterforce to the military, to the Sudanese military. The policy of divide and rule. So somehow the Janjaweed now were created and regularized, and now given this name, the Rapid Support Forces. Now it became a paramilitary group, almost akin to the to the Sudanese armed forces. Fast forward a little bit, al-Bashir is overthrown in 2019. And then the efforts to democratize Sudan started. And these efforts included now the integration, the full integration of the RSP to the Sudanese armed forces. But then the military leader of the Rapid Support Group, because he was afraid of losing power in the integration, he resisted that. And then a power struggle now started between the two, culminating in the conflict that we are now experiencing.
Wow. Wow. So essentially, these two groups were created by the previous regime to, in order to help himself keep power. And what ended up happening is they actually became very powerful and successfully overthrew him, but didn't necessarily sort out how they want to divvy up power.
Yes, so now getting to this particular conflict, we can say the two combatants are the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, against the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. One, the National Sudanese, the Sudan Armed Force, the other one, the former Janjaweed militia that became part of the South of the Sudan Armed Forces, that was at one point the one in charge of internal security during the last years of al-Bashir, had been given a lot of powers. So what are they fighting over? The main interest, of course, like any other armed force, the Sudan Armed Forces seeks to control the state, preserve the state integrity, but also maintain and preserve the army's hold on political power. Of course, it wants to suppress the RSF. The Rapid Support Forces, led by a man called Amdan Dagalo, but goes by his forest name and militia name, Hemeti. Again, origin in the Janjaweed militia, very experienced because of their fights in southern Sudan over the Darfur conflict. And again, he wants to compete over power. Remember, he didn't want full integration into the military because he knew he was going to lose his status. So, but remember, the one who controls the Sudanese government controls the military, or who controls the military controls the government, and by extension controls the resources and their distribution. So at the end of it, this is just a continuation of the previous conflicts that had been, among others, about resources and their control. When Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in 2019, Sudan was meant to transition to a civilian rule. And these two groups, the SAF and the RSF, joined together in the transitional government. But the question was, who was to control the military? Because again, whoever controlled the military controlled everything else. And therefore, these two couldn't agree.
Wow. Okay. So this seems very similar to what happens in Africa all the time. But interestingly enough, this does not seem to have as much foreign involvement as let's take Burkina Faso. It doesn't have as much foreign involvement as Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger, right? Or Senegal. But it does appear to have a high military element to it. Um, are there any foreign actors that may have interest in what is going on currently?
Actually, I was about to tell you, you are wrong in that assumption. The interest might not be so much in the conflict itself, but there are interests that are so important, there are foreign interests that are so important that they might determine the outcome of it. But here, interestingly, the usual suspects are not the key holders of these interests. Let's look at foreign powers involved in this conflict. One of the key ones that are involved here is the United Arab Emirates. You wouldn't believe it. And this has been the major supporter of the Rapid Support Forces. And remember, if you are to take the geography, you find the geographic location of where the RSF is strongest is towards the Red Sea area. So the United Arab Emirates are keen on controlling the Sudanese part of the Red Sea and the ports in the Red Sea, because those ports are very important in ensuring agricultural resources reach to their markets, as well as securing food concerns. Through that, there is also, if you are familiar with the geography, Sudan sharing a border with Libya. So the Libyans and several warlords in Libya have also an interest in it for the same reason, trying to control the Red Sea area. The second foreign power that has an interest here are the Russians. Of course, again, the Russians, because of the ongoing sanctions, they are trying whatever they can get to overcome these sanctions. So they are targeting Sudan's minerals and other resources. So the Russians have been engaged here. There's a lot of Russian weapons. The Wagner group is very strong in Sudan, helping the Sudanese military. In fact, for a long time, the Russians have wanted to establish a naval base in the port of Sudan. So, for strategic reasons, whatever Russia cannot get in the Middle East proper is trying to get it through the Red Sea area, through the port of Sudan. There are also reports that the Russians are exploiting gold and uranium from mines in areas in southern and western Sudan as a way of circumventing Western sanctions. The third major foreign interest here, you might have guessed it, is China. China is the leading force in the infrastructure development, and China wants to construct infrastructure all the way from South Africa to North Africa. So they are involved in almost every infrastructure, every important infrastructure development in the continent. So the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China seeks to secure trade routes and access again through the Red Sea region. China also